Dear God, thank you for whatever in America makes American music. That was wonderful. Amen. Some said they belonged to Paul. Others said they belonged to Apollos, and still others said they belonged to Cephas. So it looks like from the outset, Christianity was dividing into denominations. There are 33, different Presbyterian denominations in the United States. Those are the major ones. The huge United Methodist denomination is in the midst of splitting pretty much right down the middle right now over the issue of gay ordination. And evangelical churches all over the U.S., if you've been reading this week, sound just like Paul's letter. Some say they belong to Donald Trump. Others say they belong to Ron DeSantis, and still others to Mike Pence. Go figure. Why so much antagonism? Well, human nature, I suppose. Part of it is also the desire, and always has been, to be right, to have a corner on the truth with a capital T. Here's a story about a fellow who was long considered lost, but who was discovered living on a desert island. Apparently, he'd been living there quite happily for years, all by himself, no one else on the place. When found, his rescuers saw the island had 3 buildings. Man proudly pointed them out, so they asked, "What's this one?" "Well, that's my house." The fellow said, "That's where I live." "Lovely," they said. "And how about this second structure?" And he said, "Well, that's my church. That's where I go and worship on Sunday." "Fine," they said. "Very nice. What's this third building?" The man said somewhat diffidently, "That's where I used to go to church." No matter where we are, it seems we can find a reason to leave one organization or church and join another. Are you looking for the perfect church? I did some scouting around on the internet, and I found it. I did. It's a lovely brick building on McDaniel Street in South Atlanta, Georgia. And if you doubt it's the perfect church, there's a sign over the front door that spells it out clearly. It says, "The Perfect Church." And one reason it can qualify as such is because none of us has ever been inside, right? Because if we were actually to go there, we'd bring our own imperfections into it. In new members classes, here I always say the same thing. I always say, if you're looking for the perfect church or the one true church, please be advised, we are not it. We say this because we don't believe there is such a thing. Used to be that few, if ever, were tempted to believe that political parties were absolutely right or absolutely wrong. Now, some people seem to. Some world leaders are worshiped. The January insurrection was partly about that. Such all or nothing absolutism is, of course, very dangerous. We will never forget, I hope, Jim Jones of San Francisco's People's Temple way back in the 1970s. Exclusivist faith is clearly dangerous, right? Whether that faith is conservative or liberal. After all, there are fundamentalist liberals as well as fundamentalist conservatives. The more exclusivity we claim, the smaller our thinking. Is Christ divided? That was Paul's question to his friends, the Corinthians. By that time, the Apostle Paul himself had experienced division in his ministry. He had already separated himself from his first partner, Barnabas. Paul was now traveling with someone named Silas. There may have been a sharp disagreement between Paul and his original partner, maybe a falling out, maybe they were even enemies. So let me ask, do you have enemies? I'm meddling here, I know. But I grew up, at a time when we Americans had definite enemies. It wasn't a question of whether we would one day go to war with Russia, right? It was only a question of when. I suppose it was only due to the unthinkability of nuclear war that we haven't yet engaged in something full-on and impossible. Well, here's a story about a high school American history teacher looking for a way to introduce the topic, the touchy topic of the Salem witch trials to her class. You may have run across this one on the web. The teacher gave them a brief sketch of that troubling bit of Massachusetts history and then told her students they were going to play a game. She said, I'm going to come around and whisper to each of you and tell you that you're either a witch or a regular person. Your goal then will be to build the largest group possible that does not have a witch in it. And at the end of the game, any group found to have a witch in it, well, it'll get a demerit, the whole group. All witches, of course, will be immune to demerits. Well, the kids got down to business, grilling each other in every way possible about their potential witchness. They began to assemble into alliances. One pretty large group formed. Most of the students broke into small, safe, exclusivist groups, turning away anyone they thought smacked of the least bit of witchness. When the groups had formed, the teacher asked all the witches to raise their hands, and no one raised a hand. Kids were confused, and then they were incensed. They told the teacher she'd messed up the game. Did I? She asked. Was anyone in Salem an actual witch? Or did everyone just believe what they'd been told? Which gave the teacher a great platform to begin a discussion about how remarkably easy it is to divide people one from another. I became pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Ashland, Oregon in September of 1994. And the Ashland Church, which I love being in and stayed there for 14 years, was in a crisis at that time. Again, 1994. There was a divide right down the middle, kind of like the country today. 2 years before I'd gotten there, a right-wing political group in Salem, our Salem, not Massachusetts Salem, sponsored a ballot measure that targeted gay people for discrimination. You may remember this. A member of the church board moved that the board take a stand against that proposition. They voted, and the vote was something like 7-5 or 8 for it and 4 against it. I forgot. Anyway, the vote led to a rift in the church in the same proportion. One man who was on the search committee who interviewed me for the job of pastor said he wasn't necessarily in favor of that proposition, but he didn't like the church board taking a stand and thereby identifying him with the prevailing sentiment without his say. Man had a point. The church had hired me, though, knowing that I was very much against discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and that I had actively campaigned against it in our denomination. Well, it just so happened that at the moment I was hired, a measure was added to the state ballot that once again targeted gay people. And at my first meeting of session, which is the name of our church board, the same man who made the motion to take a stand against the first proposition against gay people 2 years before, moved that the session take an identical stand right then and there against the new ballot measure. What to do? What to do? Well, I asked the session to table the motion and suggested we put together a special administrative commission to do some research as to how our Presbyterian tradition might guide us before we take a vote that would just solidify the division in the church. Fortunately, the board adopted my suggestion, and the commission and I looked closely at the essential tenets of our Reformed faith, and we paid particular attention to the tenet that argues that, quote, Christ alone is Lord of the conscience. It's a very important part of Presbyterianism. The idea being that the Spirit of God moves in one heart at a time, and that we ought to respect the moving of the Spirit of God in every one of our brothers and sisters in the church. With that in mind, I suggested that instead of having the board vote the thing up or down, we should buy a quarter page of the local newspaper and invite members of the church who are passionate about opposing the proposition to ante up $2 and have their names included in an ad that was titled Presbyterians Against Measure 9. Well, the session decided that was a good idea. That way there would be no winners and no losers on our board. And the rest of the church thought that was a good idea too. So we started gathering names of members who wanted their opinion on that sensitive matter to be voiced alongside other members of the church. But word travels really fast, in small towns, and members of other churches in Ashland heard about what we were doing, and they wanted their names added to the ad as well. So we gathered names from Methodists and Lutherans and Catholics and what have you, and told the newspaper we wanted to retitle it Christians Against Measure 9. But then some Jewish brothers and sisters in the community heard about what we were doing, and they said they wanted to get on board as well. And then a few Sikhs and a few Muslims wanted to be in there too. So we, just before it went to print, had it retitled to People of Faith Against Measure 9. If we'd have gone any longer, it'd just been People. And voila, we had purchased the whole back page of the Ashland Daily Tidings, which I hope is still alive because, they're having troubles down there. And we had enough money to run the ad for several days. And it had a very positive ecumenical effect in the community, and it avoided a catastrophe at First Presbyterian Church because, a church cannot weather two identical crises like that without hemorrhaging a lot of members. Well, I had been a pastor for 14 years before that, and it wasn't my first rodeo. In the 1980s, our presbytery here in Oregon fought over lots of volatile issues. Gay ordination was one, abortion rights was another. We'd get together and debate these things, and then we'd vote, and the vote would usually come down to 51% for something and 49% against it, or the other way around. And after the vote, there was always the danger that the winning group would be smug, like college football players, after making a touchdown. As a young pastor, I'd watched this happen over and over again, and it was clear to me that no one ever won anything. We might have thought we were doing justice. We might have thought we were defending God. But it was always just an exercise in anger and vanity. We made enemies of one another, which is easy, but we avoided the hard work that the Apostle Paul calls for in this morning's text, work that requires wisdom and understanding and empathy. Enemies. The following is a kind of a confession from an anonymous source. She writes in the first person singular. I'm telling her story. She says, "I'm ashamed to admit that I have an enemy. She is my husband's ex-wife, Trudy, the mother of my stepdaughter. We send her bitter-flavored child support every month. We must pay for the child's daycare while Trudy sits at home, half a block from the center. She sends the child to us in old, stained clothing in hopes that we will return her in new clothes. She is large inside me, my enemy. Sometimes I cannot sleep at night as I plot how to force this rigid woman to be fair, to let us have as much time with the child as we are supposed to have, and to spend time with her daughter, whom she fought to keep, rather than sticking the child in that hideous daycare center. Who has she become inside of me? Who is the rigid one here, really? How can I ever begin to face what she shows me of myself? If I stop holding her thus within me, what will I do with all the space that remains?" So the division you think you're delineating isn't just between two parties. This This line you're drawing, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn famously said, runs right down the center of every one of our own hearts. So this being the truth at the heart of divisiveness, let me ask, how should we deal with profound division? Note that in this morning's text, the Apostle Paul doesn't relish the fact that some in Corinthians say they're in his court, that they call themselves part of the Paul party. No, he rejects this outright. Here's how he speaks to the problem, and I'm using Eugene Peterson's paraphrase of Paul's words. Paul says, I ask you, has the Messiah been chopped up in little pieces so we can each have a relic of all our own? Was Paul crucified for you? Was a single one of you baptized in Paul's name? He then reminds them he only baptized a few of them because some among them believed that he or she belonged to the one who poured the water. Paul continues, God didn't send me out to collect a following for myself, but to preach the message of what God has done. God didn't send me to do it with a lot of fancy rhetoric of my own, lest the powerful action at the center, Christ on the cross, be trivialized into mere words. Christ on the cross. Whenever Paul speaks about unity, he points to the cross as the place where we ought to begin. Because you don't heal division in a body when it arises by having the best argument. No vote you take on any issue is going to heal any division. It's just going to make the split all that more hostile. It takes something more like a cross to bring people together. It requires all parties to humble themselves. It takes each party recognizing the suffering of the other, which is just the flip side of the same suffering you feel yourself. That's why families that have been estranged for decades sometimes come together when there's a profound loss. Our whole nation came together on September 11th, 2001, right? In fact, the whole world did, because the next morning, the Paris paper Le Monde had a huge headline that said, "We are all Americans." Remember that? We are all Americans. The good feeling lasted about 5 minutes because we squandered it by overreacting to our fear and starting those stupid wars. So let me close this with a reflection by Annie Gottlieb of New York City that I think gets at the root of this whole thing, or at least suggests what might heal us. Annie says, "To me, the biggest obstacle to peace is tribalism. I know I have no right to criticize. However, because I have never known the passion of belonging to a tribe. I made a forlorn attempt to join a tribe once, the sannyasins of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who preached the end of all traditional tribes. Ironically, it was the tribalism of the Bhagwan's movement that drove me away. I kept thinking of all the people I love, all the people I could love, who wouldn't talk to me if I were dressed in red with the guru's picture around my neck. Maybe I lack the courage to take a stand. Maybe I just want everyone to like me. But there is this thing in me that goes for the we feeling in every encounter, the way a taproot seeks water." She says further, "I have a friend who was a hostage in Lebanon, and the story he told that made me cry was that 2 of his captors wept when he was finally released, the tears running out the eye holes of their masks." Amen.